I think there's a number of things. One of the key aspects would be around like a discourse around what higher education's purpose is, what the value of higher education is in Canada. I think a lot of the discourse, particularly my recent research around the internationalization strategies of higher education institutions, much of it is about competitiveness, about attracting inbound mobility, students particularly from Asia, and lost in that discourse might be the student experience. Whereas in what I've seen in Europe, although not perfect, there's issues around the Bologna Process and the harmonization of higher education in Europe. I think much of the impetus around this internationalization piece for higher education institutions in Europe is around mobility, internationalization at home, where it can cultivate a sense of Europeanness amongst young Europeans at university, which seems to be a very, very different set of values at play in these two contexts. But further than that, I think Canada can learn something about governance. I mean, the Canadian higher education system is very decentralized. We don't have a federal Ministry of Advanced Education, but it's also deconcentrated, meaning that much of the strategies for institutions, particularly around internationalization strategies, are set by institutions, by universities themselves. And this is supported by recent initiatives by the federal government and provincial governments. However, it is a case of herding cats, where many of these institutions are going different directions, and even inter-provincial mobility is limited in certain credentials, certain disciplines, which is something that in the last 20 years, a wider array of universities across Europe have managed to bridge that gap. So I think Canada has some learning it could do in both respects, in terms of instruments of governance, but also in terms of values and functions of higher education institutions in general. I think in terms of the types of economic instruments that are used to support higher education systems are quite different, and even different in Europe as well. Of course, the UK has quite substantial tuition fees, more than higher than the Canadian tuition fees. And Canada has a great deal of variance as well. Tuition fees are cost recovery mechanisms and increasingly expensive in many parts of Canada, but Quebec has managed to, in some respects, maintain a lower cost structure in terms of what's being charged to the students, largely because of stakeholder uprisings, if you will, in 2014, that they've managed to maintain that for their domestic students. So is there an appetite for free post-secondary education in Canada? No, that's not part of the discourse. It's certainly, we're well accustomed to reasonable tuition fees and reasonable increases every year of tuition fees across all provinces, including Quebec, who are usually, even domestic students are experiencing 3% increase in tuition fees per year. So that is a non-starter. What is interesting is the degree of variance between domestic students' fees and international students' fees is quite stark. And for that reason, because it's over 90% of universities in Canada are public institutions, they're always concerned about cost recovery mechanisms. And one of those cost recovery mechanisms, rather than increasing domestic tuition fees, is this international students' inbound mobility as a cash cow. It's unfortunate to see internationalization in this light. And yet it is a means for many universities which are struggling with their provincial block grants to actually fund education for the domestic students as well. So we're kind of at a dilemma, which means that tuition fees are not going away. They're going to increase in Canada over time. Indeed, we might be experiencing the same in Europe in the near future as well. I know that there has been some move towards tuition fees in Germany, and then it was retracted again. And even there's a very few countries left in Europe that are offering international students no tuition fees whatsoever. A handful of countries like, not in the EU, but Norway, for example. The model now is that international students represent a cost recovery mechanism, and it's a model that Canada has adopted for some time. I think all higher education systems are moving that direction, for good or for ill. Especially in British Columbia, where I'm from, is that domestic student enrollment is dropping, particularly in the social sciences, but international student enrollment is making up the shortfall. And so it creates new pressures on faculty, but also on students around expectations, credentials, grade inflation, issues around, so it's a lot of the students that I'm teaching who are international students are experiencing acute anxiety because they're being sent from countries in a culturally unfamiliar environment and expected to perform, especially if their families are paying quite high tuition fees. And conversely, there's pressure on the faculty to maintain standards, yet also understand that these are students that are experiencing kind of these acute pressures themselves. It's a really difficult situation, a bit of a situation that's generated a lot of interest. I've noticed in a number of presentations I've been doing recently, a lot of my faculty colleagues are interested in internationalization and also in Europeanization of higher education in Canada. What is the effect of Bologna, Erasmus, EUCAnet, these things on the Canadian higher education sector? Are we looking to them for lessons? Are we looking to Europe for lessons? Increasingly it seems no, but there are lessons that we could be learning if we were willing to understand what Bologna has done for quality assurance, for mobility, outbound and inbound mobility. So I think there's missed lessons that we could capitalize on. But we are a pan-Canadian study tour that has undergraduate and advanced undergraduate and master's students from across Canada, from universities as Dalhousie, Bishops, York University, U of T, University of Montreal, UBC, and others. And the study tour is, I think it's the 15th year that the study tour has been operational. This is my 4th year running it as director myself. So it's a very stable, robust program, a three-week field school and tour where we actually go to the European Union institutions, mainly in Brussels, but also in Strasbourg and in Luxembourg and Frankfurt. And we visit these institutional sites, and rather than having academics speak with the students, with the participants, we have people at the coalface, the policymakers, the diplomats, the civil society actors who are relevant for European integration and the European Union, have conversations and seminars with our students and participants to learn what the European Union, how the European Union makes itself on a daily basis. Of course, there are professors there, myself, and also visiting professors to help contextualize the issues, but that's what makes the study tour, I think, unique, is that it's not yet another university course. It's an experience within the EU. I do know from testimonies and evaluations of past students that it's had a profound effect on many of their choices in the future, some of which because it's really generated a huge amount of knowledge in a short period of time for students who participate in the tour. They have this very intensive experience, intellectual and social, because you're meeting other Canadians also interested in the European Union and traveling with them for 3 weeks. So it has that effect on having people consider how important the European Union is, increasingly so because of CETA and other factors like this. And it's training the next generation of Europeanists. So many of our participants will go on to be employees at Global Affairs Canada with a European understanding of knowing what European integration is and what the European Union does and how it relates to our Canadian values and Canadian interests. Further to that, there's a kind of value-added component on the study tour, which is the internship program. So about half of our participants can volunteer, they self-select into this program where they do an internship with an EU or European integration-related organization, host organization, typically in Brussels for 2 months, although there's some variance. We have a few partners in other areas of Europe as well. And this internship program can be instrumental for networking for the students, but also giving them a sense of career choices and options in civil society, but also within public sector and European Union institutions. So this is something that we also offer as part of for those participants who want to kind of further their in-depth knowledge of Europe.